Well, today we conclude our series, Faithful Regardless, a study of 1 Samuel that we started May 2nd of this year. So we have gone through most of the year studying 1 Samuel. And we studied the lives of people who were rewarded for their faithfulness, or they suffered the consequences for their unfaithfulness. And their names were Hannah and Eli and Samuel and Saul and Jonathan and Michal and David. Now, most of the book focused on the relationship between David and Saul. And remember, David showed great commitment. He stayed faithful to God by showing mercy to Saul, even during the time Saul was repeatedly trying to take David's life, chasing him down through extreme jealousy to try to kill him. And David was faithful regardless. Now, the lessons learned for all 31 chapters is this: being faithful regardless means doing the right thing even when you have every excuse not to. The Lord is pleased by our obedience and rewards our faithfulness. I'm just going to repeat that. Being faithful regardless means doing the right thing even when you have every excuse not to. The Lord is pleased by our obedience and he rewards our faithfulness. So, let's get into it. Previously on Faithful Regardless, after not seeking God for several chapters, David returns to inquiring of the Lord after finding his village burned, his family and the families of all his men taken captive, and his men so distressed that they were talking of killing him. So, 1 Samuel 30, remember what happened. Verse 6, David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters, but David found strength in the Lord his God. Remember, we focused on the fact that David learned to find strength in the Lord his God. David knew how to find strength, and it was by inquiring of the Lord, by putting his own agenda aside. Verse 7 says this: David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" "Pursue them," he answered. "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." And in verse 18, David pursued them, and it says David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken. Okay, so now we come to the season finale. The season finale. But before we go to the last chapter, let's remember back in chapter 11. This isn't the beginning of Saul's establishment as king. He's just newly installed as king. And his first mission was to rescue the people of Jabesh Gilead. And these are people who were being threatened by the Ammonites. And it was very brave of Saul. So let's just jump back to 1 Samuel 11. And it says this in verse 1. Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." But Nahash the Ammonite replied, "I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace on all Israel." The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days so we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you." Okay, Jabesh Gilead, it's a small village, and these are people that are from the half tribe of Manasseh. They likely intermarried with Benjaminites. That's how they came about. Nahash, who's the head of the Ammonites, his name means snake. And he's someone who is besieging this town. As we just read, he said, "Okay, we're going to take your town, and we'll do you a favor. We won't kill you if you let us gouge out everybody's right eye as a disgrace to Israel." Now, obviously, this is a big threat. The elders asked for a week to make a choice. They had to come up with a choice. And so, verse 4, it says this: When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they wept aloud. And just when Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen, he asked, "What's wrong with everyone? Why are they weeping?" And then they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh had said. And when Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. He took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." And then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came together as one. And when Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel outnumbered 300,000, and those of Judah 30,000. So there's 330,000 people that Saul assembled to come up against the Ammonites. And he did. And it was very graphic invitations that he sent, but he was able to muster the unity of the entire nation. And so, verse 9, they told the messengers who had come, "Say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be rescued." When the messengers went and reported this to the men of Jabesh, they were elated. And they said to the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do with us whatever you like." You see, the men of Jabesh heard that help was on the way, and then they just made this false promise to the Ammonite. Well, here's what happens. Verse 11, the next day Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night, they broke camp into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered so that no 2 were left together. You see, Saul was victorious in battle. See, not only did he save the people, these poor threatened people of Jabesh Gilead, but he also earned a reputation early on as a great leader, as a wise warrior king, and someone who could unite Israel. That's the first king. He was able to do all this. So here is Saul's finest moments. His finest moments. But it didn't last. No, as time went on, Saul did not honor God. He did not operate in obedience and humility. In fact, he repeatedly disobeyed the Lord's commands and pursued his own way. He also became, as we saw, extremely jealous of David's success and spent most of the later years of the book chasing David, murderously jealous of David and trying to kill him. And his mind had become terribly troubled, maybe even psychotic. Saul had become such a pitiful character that by the end of his life, his legacy as a heroic king was down in the dumps, and it just was swallowed up by his horrific actions and his bad behavior. So here we go, Saul's last stand. This is about 12 years or so after that heroic stand as the rescuer of the Jabesh Gileads. But now it's the final battle. It's the final battle of the entire book of 1 Samuel, and it's the Philistines and the Israelites. And the Philistines' army is coming up against the Israelites on Mount Gilboa. So here we go. Now what happens is, you'll see right away, the Philistines are so strong and pervasive that the Israelites are running away because God's hand of power and protection has departed from Saul. And so the glory of God has departed from Saul's kingdom, Ichabod, as name we heard early on in this chapter. So are we ready for the final chapter? The final chapter, 1 Samuel 31, only has 13 verses. And here they are. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead in Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. So Saul's 3 sons died right away in the battle of Gilboa, including the beloved Jonathan. And Saul himself was critically injured. He wasn't dead, but he was critically injured. Verse 4, Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men died together that same day. Wow. Saul was apparently hit by arrows and knew he was about to die. He didn't want the Philistines to have the pleasure of executing him and abusing him, so he asked his armor bearer to put him out of his misery, but the armor bearer refused to do it. And Saul did it himself. He fell on his own sword. And so seeing this, the armor bearer, he gave up hope as well, and he committed suicide. 2 suicides and many deaths. And that's how the heroic and once brave first king of Israel met his peril. So there they lay on the fields until the Philistines arrived. Let's go to verse 7. When the Israelites along the valley and across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled. And the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen at Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor on the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Bet-shean. This is a gross display of mockery, not only against Saul, but against all of Israel and against their God. This was a token of arrogance. Philistines decided to make their temple a place to display proudly their defeat and the humiliation of King Saul. Now, Bet-shean is a city near Mount Gilboa. It's where the fighting took place. And it's actually currently one of the largest excavations with massive ruins and well-preserved structures in Israel. The Roman ancient city is below a hill, an elevated hill, that is Bet-shean. The place means house of rest or house of perpetuity, depending on how you interpret it. Now, the city is elevated, and even now it stands as a reminder of Saul's defeat. In fact, when you go to Bet-shean, there's like I said, an elevation, like a hill, a bump right in the middle of the old ruins. And on the top of it, there's a tree, a dead tree that's been there for who knows how long. But it's a marker of the place where they believe Saul's bodies, his body and his son's bodies were hung by the Philistines. In fact, I have a couple pictures, and maybe we'll show them to you here. Here's me standing in the amphitheater of Bet-shean, and behind me is that green hill. And if you could look in that little circle, that's a tree. It's a dead stump of a tree. Here's a close-up view of it as well, that dead stump of a tree. And that's what people believe, or supposedly believe, was the spot where Saul's body was hung, right there in Bet-shean. Now, think about this. Saul's body, the bodies of his sons, all decapitated, being hung in a Philistine city. Mockery over all Israel. What do you think could be done about it? Now, David was not around. We don't see David until the next book, 2 Samuel. So could anybody do anything about this mockery? And yes, there are some. And if you remember, the men of Jabesh-Gilead. Let's go to verse 11. When the people of Jabesh-Gilead heard that the Philistines had what they had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bet-shean. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bet-shean and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. And then they took their bones and they buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. And that's how the whole book ends, all 31 chapters. But these brave men were faithful regardless. The men of Jabesh-Gilead, whose city had been saved about a dozen years earlier by Saul when he was in his finer moments, they risked their lives to sneak through or fight through the Philistine forces to get these corpses of these men, the royal family, Saul and his sons, and bring them back to Israel territory and give them a proper Israeli burial. They did this to honor Saul and his sons, but not just that. They believed it was the right thing to do, and I think they did it to honor God and his people. Their faithfulness was impressive, and I believe that they were rewarded for that. Now, did Saul deserve this? No, he didn't deserve it, especially in his later years. Did God request that they go do it? Well, we don't read that God requested them risking their lives to get these decapitated corpses. Did it change the results of the battle? Nope. The Battle of Gilboa was lost to the Philistines. But it showed honor, and it showed respect for God's man, God's king at the time, and faithfulness to God regardless of the situation. We could learn so much, the example of the men of Jabesh-Gilead, along with what we learned through many of the characters through this book. Remember Hannah? Hannah, who was a barren woman, pleading to God for a son, and said, if you give me a son, I'll give him right back to you for a life of service. God gave her a son, Samuel, and she gave him right back to God to serve in the tabernacle. How about Samuel himself? He was faithful to hear from God, and he would get words from God that were hard words, tough words, and he'd have to go and bring them to a maniac king who knows what the repercussions would be. Yet he was faithful to deliver the word of God to Saul, regardless of what the message might be. And then David as a young boy serving Saul. You remember back in chapter 16 when David was playing his harp just to soothe Saul's paranoia. And David could already see Saul becoming undone, yet serving God by being faithful to Saul and serving Saul. And then in later years, he had at least two opportunities to take Saul's life immediately, and he didn't, even though Saul was there for the sole purpose of killing him. So David, he was faithful to God, serving and honoring Saul, regardless of how Saul treated him in return. Friends, we have an obligation to be faithful to God, regardless of the circumstances we're experiencing, regardless of what we're facing. You know, I've had many times in my life where I felt, my situation warrants me, not being so faithful or harboring a bad attitude. Multiple times. I remember one time I was in my final weeks of a job, and I had just been offered a better job, and I knew I was going to take it. And so, the people that were in charge were not happy with me, and quite honestly, I wasn't happy with them either. So my temptation in the final weeks were, I don't even need to give it my all. I could just be half-hearted. I could burn some bridges, say some parting shots and things like that. But no, the Lord convicted me that it's Him that I'm working for, not these people. In fact, as much as it pained me, I did all I could to finish well and be faithful regardless. It's not perfect, but I believe God blessed me for it, because 1 Corinthians 10:31, Paul says this. He says, whatever you do, do to the glory of God. Can we receive that? Whatever you do in your work, in your dealings with your relationships with family and friends, spouses, family members, neighbors, people you like, people you don't like, people you serve under, people who work for you, to be faithful to God regardless of them. Remember, he says, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. So there's going to be times where each of us are forced to make tough choices, and we're going to have to be faithful regardless, just like those people we read about throughout this book. Some will require us to do things to show our faithfulness to God, even when we don't feel like it. In fact, even when we feel like doing the opposite. But these are the moments when we're to be obedient to God's commands and faithful regardless of the circumstances, because it's only then that we can experience God's pleasure by pleasing Him, and God's favor by being faithful to Him. So my message for you, for all of you who have been part of this series in any form, any part, is to remember these words. Being faithful regardless means doing the right thing even when you have every excuse not to. The Lord is pleased by our obedience, and He rewards our faithfulness. God bless you.